Hello, everybody, and welcome to Geopolitical Trends, where truth matters. Excited to be with you as always. I'm even more excited today because we have our monthly conversation with none other than Dr. Warwick Powell and Einar Tangen. Very, very excited to be. Let me bring my guests over here. Hi, Einar. Hi, Warwick.
Hi, David.
How are you?
Good to have you here, guys. For those who do not know, which you should know by now, who Einar is, let me start by introducing Einar first. Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at CIGI, which stands for Center for International Governance Innovation. He's also an international commentator on geopolitics and the global economy. By the way, guys, I put a full bio in the video description. Make sure to take a look at it. Dr. Warwick Powell is an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. He is also a senior fellow at the Tahi Institute in Beijing. He is the author of, and I have the book copy for you here, guys, an image of it right here. He's the author of China, Trust and Digital Supply Chains. There's something you might want to read up on it. So he's also the host of the TIO Talks with Warwick Powell. I have a link for you in the chat box here. Make sure to take a look at that channel, subscribe to it, and you'll hear some very, very interesting conversation there. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, David.
All right. Einar, I'm going to start with you. I want to ask, first of all, your overall assessments about the recent conclusion of the G20 summit in South Africa. What do you make out of that summit? What strikes you as sort of a positive and negative and so forth?
Well, I think the overwhelming thing is the abdication of U.S. leadership. It's not only here, but it was also at COP30. The U.S. has decided that it doesn't care about the international institutions at the same time that it is trying to manipulate them for its own benefit. I don't think this can go on very, very long. The positive side is that you have the rest of the world trying to figure out what they're going to do. I think it's really important that there's a realization that this kind of hope that the U.S. will come back in and be a steady, reliable partner is basically over. When you have the president of the United States who has been elected for the second time, not successfully, you have to understand that there is going to be no commitment, a lasting commitment that's going to be up and down and therefore unreliable. And then on the geopolitical stage, all the institutions that the U.S. championed are now on the dustbin as far as the U.S. is concerned. And once again, this is reliability. So other countries have realized that they're going to have to try to figure this out themselves. And I think this is really important vis-a-vis the global South. They do not have a choice here. They, instead of waiting for other entities to figure out, how they can be helpful, they have to figure it out on themselves. And what I mean by this is that there's a realization that the resource curse, where developed countries have been, in essence, like France, taking resources as they did from the Sahels, buying yellow cake at 20 cents euro per pound and then selling it for 200 euros per pound, that those days have to end. That these countries have to take control of their resources, start creating bourses where they set the prices, much like OPEC did, or continues to do, so that they have enough money to address their own development concerns, pay their farmers and the supply chains what is necessary, invest in creating markets and downstream products, and ultimately, instead of begging for climate change funds, I think the number was $100 billion a year was supposed to be thrown into it. And we've just seen a trickle of that, about 44 billion over these many years, that they have to go out and take care of these things themselves. That means that they need to have the revenues coming in. So I think the world is on track for some very, very large changes. And hopefully they'll be positive. They'll reverse this kind of money flow or wealth flow that has been flowing from the third world to developed countries, and it'll even it out, hopefully.
Very, very interesting perspective. This leads me to just pave the way into the next question regarding the G20 summit for you, Warwick. In your opinion, in your assessment, did the absence of the United States for the summit here matter? In other words, is the world moving on without the United States?
Well, the world invariably has to move on. And I think that the G20 summit that just recently concluded showed the capacity of the world to refashion a focus around things that matter to more and more countries. And importantly, I think the G20 also showed that the voices from the global south were able to be amplified and set a very strong tone for coordinated action going forward. So the fact that the United States wasn't there, in some respects, reinforced the fact that the United States has, in many regards, stepped back and has receded from a more traditional role of global leadership. But in doing so, it has left open the space that other countries are filling. Vacuums are filled, and the global south has grabbed the opportunity, in part because of the ballast that China's economic strength globally provides, to have its own issues and priorities articulated and amplified. And you see that in the declaration that was made at the G20. Interestingly, that declaration was actually made on the first day as well, which really, I think, demonstrated the ability of the host nation and the Sherpas involved in pulling things together to arrive at important consensus positions on critical issues and set the tone for what proceeded thereafter. So the world is changing. The G20 continues to evolve. It's had high watermark periods in the aftermath of the global financial crisis some 16 years ago. It's had periods where it has been relatively unimportant in a sense. And I think we are now starting to see a G20 exploring ways in which it can become relevant again as a critical coordination point as multipolarity continues to take shape. So we can be, I think, energized by this focus, but be mindful of the fact that this focus on global south priorities is actually not done in a way that opposes all countries being involved, but it's actually saying we've been excluded for a long time. We want our seat at the table. We want our issues to be heard and understood. And we want to be part and parcel of a globe that has shared aspirations and that can coordinate and work together towards the achievement of those.
Very, very interesting. Warwick, I'm sorry, Einar, I'm going to get back to you on this point here, because what I would like you, if you could please share with the community here. You mentioned this earlier as far as where things are headed. And as a matter of fact, various reports indicate that the decline that exists within the G20 is not temporary, but rather reflects some sort of a deep structural shift in the structure of the international governance. Is this means, in your opinion, we're going to see the role played by BRICS, by ASEAN, will be able to fill that vacuum, in your opinion, Einar?
Well, let's look at the history. I mean, what happened is post-World War II, you start these institutions. It's all supposed to be handled at the UN. But after a while, the UN, unfortunately, becomes gridlocked, too many different agendas. And then you have more countries that are more equal than others. You then have the G7 and 8 and back to 7. Come up. This was a kind of paternalistic grouping that said, "Hey, we know better. We're rich. They didn't say we took things from you, but that was the truth of it. They had excoriated wealth through colonial means for many years, But they said, we know better. You should listen to us. Then you have the 2008-9 crisis, and all of a sudden, this group, instead of being the solution, has been the problem. The U.S. Caused it by taking away these safeguards that were necessary to keep banks, insurance companies, and brokerages from basically pilfering the savings of individuals in the United States. So they came up with the G20. They needed to enlarge the base to do that, and it didn't do a bad job in terms of coming out of the financial crisis. It certainly helped prevent a lot of kind of additional nastiness that could have occurred given the scope of what happened, and the fact that the U.S. had their fingerprints all over it.
Yeah.
And then, where are we today? The G20 is not the G20 it was. I mean, you basically have the U.S. Bowing out, and the rest of the countries are kind of in search of how to do it. I agree with everything that Warwick said in terms of the necessity of change. The question is how. So in the meantime, because especially the G20 took a pass on COVID, they were not effective at creating a global response. It has kind of fallen to regional groups that are developing. You see ASEAN, you see BRICS, you see the SCO, Mercos, African Union, and coincidentally, most of them in the global South. These are countries that were bypassed in the past. They have interests, as we were just discussing, for instance, with climate change, but they're not being addressed by the major parties who are in favor of status quo, or even in terms of U.S., taking the status quo another step and saying that it should be a welfare status quo for the United States. This just doesn't sound sound attractive to the majority of the world's population, land, GDP, manufacturing, this idea that somehow they should be subservient to the U.S. or other global powers. So right now it's in a bit of disarray, but it's difficult to replace the G20. You still need to have as many people at the table as possible. The question is, how does this entity move back into relevance from right now? It's more of an ideas and talk shop. I do agree that it was impressive that without the U.S. there, it changed the entire tone of the event, just as it did with COP30. Even though COP30 and the G20 don't have a lot to point to in terms of substance, but you look at the pictures, you look at the leaders as they gather. They're comfortable, they're joking, even though they still have a lot of issues. They were comfortable with each other. Contrast that with any time that Donald Trump is in the room. My goodness, I mean, it's just awkward silence. You see little groups kind of whispering to themselves, and Donald Trump looking offended and isolated because he makes himself that way. So you have an interesting situation. We're in in a kind of sea change period, and what will come back will come up or take leadership. I think will be more on a regional basis until there's enough of them that they can hopefully address changes at the UN and figure out how to make it workable, get rid of this kind of exorbitant privilege that the top five have.
Very interesting insights for this. Just to piggyback on this, Warwick, and before we move on to the next topic here, is this means now, in your opinion, Warwick, that the G20 is no longer able to produce some sort of what I'm looking for, political consensus, if I may use the term? And why this might be the case, as some might argue, is because the new world is taking some sort of shape in which the centers of power are distributed outside its umbrella. Will that be a fair assessment in your opinion?
Well, I think it sort of misses the forest by being obsessed with the trees a little bit. The multipolar world or a multinodal world is also a multi-layered world. there are many layers of institutions that are part and parcel of how countries coordinate their actions with each other. And these different kinds of institutions will ultimately fulfill different kinds of roles, many of which will overlap with others, but nonetheless provide forums in which perspectives and interests can be coordinated and aligned. So the G20 continues to exist in parallel to the existence of organizations like BRICS, just as we have the New Development Bank in existence in parallel to institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So the unfolding nature, if you will, of the multipolar world is also a multi-institutional world. We have the World Trade Organization as a global peak trade governance body, but at the same time, there are a myriad of regional multilateral trading institutions, not to mention the hundreds of bilateral trading arrangements that exist, all of which contribute to the sort of broader fabric. Whether or not a particular institution functions effectively in part depends on the heft that its members bring to the table. So the G7, for example, is going to be progressively less important, but nonetheless will persist for a period of time whilst its members seek to find ways that they coordinate and advance the interests that they believe they share. But ultimately, the heft that member organisations bring to the table and their ability to, through various forms of suasion, whether it's moral suasion, economic suasion, and what have you, can bring others together to form these consensuses is where it's going to matter. So, whether it's the SCO, whether it's BRICS, whether it's the G20, whether it's the African Union itself, all of these institutions are ultimately going to play some role in being platforms through which nations can not only have their voices heard, which is vitally important, but ultimately also opportunities where nations, through their leaders and the work that's done by Sherpas in between summits, can actively coordinate the work that they do in the name of achieving common objectives.
Very interesting. Thank you very much for sharing this work and Einar on this topic. I wanted the community to have a better understanding of this recent G20 summits, because what the media is stating versus what the reality is. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to ask you for your assessment on this. Einar, I would like to move on to another topic here regarding the U.S. national debt, which has reached, as you know, about $38 trillion. And this, a lot of people in the know of how finance and economics work and so forth will have, or already having several negative economic implications that including, for example, higher interest payments and crowd out public investments, increase inflations and so forth. How do you see this playing out, let's say, within the next few months? Till the meeting between President Trump and President Xi in April 2026?
Well, in the next couple of months, you're just going to see more debt. It could get to 40 trillion. They're just piling it on. But you have to sort of think it's fine to say, oh, look, there's a fire. Okay, the question is, what are people doing about it? And what they're doing about it is actually exacerbate the situation. I'm sure many of your members have heard about stablecoin. The idea behind stablecoin sounds very, very attractive, as does all con games. What I say to you is hey, look, I'm not going to do Bitcoin, which has no backing. I'm going to go out and buy U.S. Treasuries, a very safe, asset. And then I'm going to issue coins based on it. So I'll buy $1,000 worth of, or $10 million worth of treasuries, and then I'll issue $10 million worth of stable coins. And then the stable coins kind of float based on the value of what people perceive, or in terms of the actual underlying value of the U.S. treasuries. Well, why is this happening now? Why has Donald Trump and the Besant and all this crew suddenly said, oh, this is a great idea? There's a lot of skepticism in the past. And the reason is that they're trying to find a market for all of this debt. So if I get all these people to buy more treasuries, oh, gee, I have a solution to my huge debt pile. Otherwise, I'm in a situation where the existing buyers of this kind of debt, treasuries, they just say, well, I don't need it anymore. All right. You have central banks at their lowest level of holding treasuries, and the ones that are holding lots of it, like Japan, are not, are just doubling down on debt. That is not a long-term comforting situation if I was in Japan or a Japanese citizen. So here they have this, what I would call a scheme to get people to, basically buy up this debt, thinking that it is somehow safe. But then it gets worse. It used to be that the way it worked was I would go out, take all this money, turn it into these coins, asset-backed coins, and my profit was I would keep the interest. So there's treasuries always have interest, and I would keep that, and and make a lot of money. The more I issued, the more interest in things, and basically I'm safe. No matter what happens, it's going to pay 1% on the or 2% on the total value of whatever the face value of that treasury was. So I was assured of it. But in financial terms, I was an investment banker. I used to create products and oversee them, things like that. It wasn't enough. They want to make more. So how do you make more in this kind of situation? Well, you get the authorities to turn a blind eye to the fact that you're buying different asset classes. So instead of just buying treasuries, which is easy to understand, despite the fact that they might go down by 20% because Donald Trump wants to devalue them in order to make U.S. products more competitive overseas, at least it's something you can see and understand. Now they're switching this idea that maybe 70, 80% are treasuries, and the rest we'll invest. You can only imagine what that investment is. They're supposed to do it in non-volatile, commodity. I mean, entities, assets, like gold. Gold doesn't go up and down very much, does it? Oh, wait a second.
Oh, let me think.
So basically, they're creating huge amounts of institutional risk, and when it goes south, it'll make the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9 look horrible. But I hear Warwick coughing in the background. I think he can weigh in on this. He's an expert.
Well, actually, I was gonna follow up with Warwick on this one here. Warwick, the idea of this national debt, as I mentioned earlier, there's several kind of economic or negative economic impacts, increased inflation, of course, the higher payment, interest payments, that is, and the higher borrowing cost for both the consumers and the businesses. We're not even talking about the slower economic growth. In your opinion, Warwick, in the case of the United States here, do you think that the government here will have the ability to respond to a future crisis given where things are?
I think there's a few things to unpack here. The first thing to understand is that private debt's actually a far greater problem in the scheme of the American national economy and where it's at the moment than public debt. That's the first thing. The second thing to remember is that public debt is not a solvency problem. It has other consequences and implications, but the reason why it's not a solvency problem is because the debt is owed in a currency that, in fact, the borrower issues originally. So, in fact, it's borrowing back what it issued before. So that's the second thing to bear in mind. So what are the issues here? Well, the issues are that what we're really dealing with is a liquidity management system that runs through different institutions and circuits that either contribute to mitigating the risks of systemic entropy, which is a fragmentation and collapse of a system, in this case, a social, political, and economic system, or it contributes to the hastening of factors that may contribute to greater systemic entropy, which means we need to understand where the additional liquidity actually goes and how additional liquidity within the system functions. Much of the liquidity that goes into the system by way of new government issued money through government spending ends up actually working its way into what we could call the circuits of fictitious capital. It tends not to find its way into the circuits of fixed capital formation, which is the building of infrastructure and the establishment of factories and those sorts of things, but ultimately ends up within circuits where money capital chases fictitious capital, such as stocks, options, and other financial derivatives. So what we actually end up seeing is that this mechanism by which liquidity is injected into the American national economy ends up fast tracking or adding fuel to asset bubbles. And so, unsurprisingly, you'll see that as money supply grows, so too does stock exchange valuations. And unsurprisingly, as that grows, the financial wealth of a small minority consolidates and expands, and in fact, it leads to greater systemic inequalities. So that's actually what's going on here. The fact that there are markets for these instruments is a little bit by the by, because let's face it, most of these instruments are owned and traded by those with sufficient depths of capital to actually participate in all of this. So that's your real problem, I think. I've written a long piece explaining all of these intricacies on my Substack actually some months ago. People, I think, are a little bit too focused on questions of solvency, which is the wrong question. And they need to be a lot more focused on the ways in which liquidity management, the injection of liquidity, how it flows through the system, and how liquidity is taken out of the system actually interacts with the real economy. The other thing to bear in mind is the historical evidence over the last few years actually doesn't support the general claim that growth of government injections leads to substantial inflation. In fact, what tends to support the inflation story is a collapse in supply chains. Right. And we saw that largely as a consequence of COVID, where supply chains and production systems were significantly disrupted. We're continuing to see that because the United States real economy, which is being undermined by the expansion of the fictitious capital market, doesn't have the capacity to meet the material needs of the American economic system in general. And unsurprisingly, to meet those needs, it imports most of these things. So I think that that's where we need to be focusing our attention.
Very interesting. By the way, just for the community, I'm going to put the link to Warwick's Substack account there. You can, guys, access it, and you can sign up there and read the articles. And I know which one Warwick was talking about because I had a chance to read it earlier on. So, but with this, Warwick, before we move on to the next theme here, do you think, in your opinion, the upcoming possibility of meeting between President Trump and President Xi in April 26, following the phone call they just had, in your opinion, do you think Donald Trump will ask the Chinese to buy more U.S. treasuries?
Well, whether he does or he doesn't sort of isn't going to make that much of a difference in the global scheme of things. Interestingly, between 2018 and 2023, which was the period in which China's People's Bank of China's holdings of treasuries progressively declined, from about 1.2, 1.3 trillion, say 10 years or so ago, to $760 billion today. So it's dropped quite substantially. But interestingly, during that period, so 2018 to 2023, 5-6 years, China's lending to American enterprises and infrastructure projects grew to about $200 billion. So what we saw was China taking its US dollar surpluses, which it's accumulated through trade, and cycling them into direct loans to concrete projects rather than buying liquid securities, government-backed securities. I'm actually quite convinced that was not the outcome that the hawks in Washington on Capitol Hill actually wanted to see, because now China is a significant equity lender to American projects, including many infrastructure projects. As much as the hawks talk about Chinese creditors being the drivers of debt trap diplomacy, perhaps Washington needs to have a good look at the unintended consequences of its own harebrained schemes.
Einar, what do you think? Will Donald Trump ask President Xi to buy U.S. treasuries to ease up the pain?
No, you understand, it wouldn't make a difference. China's at 700 or plus things, and you can tell exactly where Chinese treasury holdings are going to be, because it's an amount necessary to smooth out trade. They don't want to buy and sell renminbi back and forth. So as trade declines with the U.S., so will that. To the extent that they turn that over, as Warwick has pointed out, into different kinds of assets, that is another situation. I would venture to say that will peter off. The U.S. economy is not a good bet. I disagree slightly. I think you can continue to pay interest on the bonds by printing money. But that's the definition of a Ponzi scheme. The fact that it's done by a government doesn't change the fact that at some point you run out of runway, and people just have no faith. Things, the printer presses are going at 1,000,000 miles an hour, but the rates keep going up because no one believes in the underlying product. And I think that is something that could really hit things hard. In terms of the meeting between Xi and Donald Trump, remember, Donald Trump is, as we've seen with the Japanese situation, he's always trying to manufacture leverage. So he was going to get his proverbial hiney kicked in Busan, because he was coming to the table with nothing, and he had asks. He needed those strategic minerals, and China had a lock on them. So he went around, made a big show of going to Australia. He went to Malaysia, Vietnam, pretending that he was going to put together a consortium that could rival China. It's nonsense. Take 5 to 7 years just to put enough together to take care of strategic interests. It would take 10 to 15 years to figure out a way to address the interests of your industry. By that time, both of them would be, dead meat. So he's somewhere in between. So he stopped in Japan, and then a few days later, after he's left and kind of holding nothing, Japan comes out with these kind of silly pronouncements that they would go to war with China if there is any attempt to take back what is already China's. Is it so? How is China dealing with this? They've known all along. They've studied Donald Trump in minute detail. They know what he does. They knew he would try to seek leverage, that he'll use his, quote, madman politics and proxies to kind of push issues where he doesn't have direct, push the bully. When the bully thing doesn't work, he gets around the edges. He gets other people to attack you. And that's exactly what he's done with Japan. He emboldened her to make these statements so that he, in essence, manufactures a crisis, and then he can swoop in. Xi Jinping called him. He loves that. Absolutely. I mean, this is the recognition he craves. Somebody who has a very, very deep psychological problem with self-worth, covering it up with bluster and things like this. And then he could make his phone call to the Japanese prime minister and make her kowtow to the line and things like that. Make it clear to everybody that he's in control. These meetings that have been promised are in essence just a slow play of the United States. They understand that they have 3 years of this guy with an unknown after that. But in the meantime, how do you survive it? Well, you keep him at the table. You keep it transactional. You keep promising him things. If he's good, you'll buy up some agricultural products and things like this. If he's good, you'll allow him to have what he needs in terms of strategic minerals for his regular industry, not defense industry. So this is their plan. And Donald Trump, as I said, continues to try to find leverage. China continues to try to last out this very, very difficult period with somebody who is so uniquely unqualified and ignorant as Donald Trump.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the issue of Japan, because that was the next thing we're going to be talking about. And as a matter of fact, I want to start with you on this topic, then I'll move into Warwick. In your opinion, Einar, what triggers Japan Prime Minister Sanae Takahashi to embark on this provocative and ill-conceived statements regarding China? To me personally, was mind-boggling, was that knowing historically that no former prime minister in Japan crossed that red line. What prompted her to do so, in your opinion, Einar?
Well, there's two things. First off, remember, she's unelected. She was put in there through party machinations because of the unpopularity of a series of these guys. This is the LDP, a party that was created by the CIA to run China, involving war criminals. How else can you put it? Shinzo Abe's grandfather was part of it. He was a war criminal. He just didn't go to jail. And suddenly he's in a position of great power in Japan. So there is a holding entity for U.S. interests. We still maintain troops there. It's a conquered and occupied country. Now, she's interesting in that she represents the Abe school, but a little bit further to the right. She really wants to go back and deny that Nanjing was really a massacre. She wants to rewrite history, in essence, saying the only crime that Japan committed was, to lose the war. She doesn't want to talk about the 35 million Chinese who died from direct or indirect actions of the Japanese occupation. She just wants to gloss it all over and say, well, Japan should be a normal country. And in order to do that, she wants to have this military. So she needs to have an enemy that her current sponsors don't like. And who is that? China. So in essence, she's using China as an excuse to kind of play out her fantasies that Japan will once again become a massive power able to dominate regionally. Not something nobody wants, except her, even within her own government. And the second part of that was Donald Trump egging her on from the sides to take a whack at China so he could create leverage for himself.
Very interesting. Warwick, can you please just place for my community, just to understand this, the Japan-China tensions within its proper geopolitical context?
Well, the current Japanese Prime Minister is a proto-fascist. She wants to revise, as Einar said, the historical record, and she wants to revive Japanese fascist militarism. I think that's all we need to say on the matter. People across Asia will fully understand and appreciate what that means. They experienced Japanese atrocities and violence and barbarism during the course of the Second World War period. And of course, the people of China experienced it well before then, going back to 1931. I should just mention one other thing, so I won't talk any more about it. She just represents the fascist arm of Japanese body politics with a bit of luck. The majority of Japanese people will wake up to the fact that this places Japan on the wrong side of history. It's clearly erroneous, and it does not aid in Japan actually being able to confront and address the serious issues that it actually has. Its economy is not rosy. It has strategic security questions that actually impinge on Japan. They aren't China, they're actually the DPRK. And without China's good officers, Japan would have far greater problems insofar as the DPRK is concerned. As far as that little game that she's playing by putting medium-range missiles 110 kilometers from Taiwanese shores, well, that's just child's play. And if she really wants to get serious, I think the question she needs to think deeply about is whether or not Washington is going to sacrifice Washington, New York, Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, or any other great American city in the name of defending Tokyo. It won't. So let's get real. She needs to wake up to herself. The other thing I should just mention briefly is that that phone call that took place between President Xi and President Trump, both sides now acknowledge was actually initiated by the American side. So all the excitement that seemed to bubble away yesterday in the mainstream Western media, I think led largely by some nonsensical reporting once again from the Wall Street Journal, led a bunch of folk up the garden path, and in many respects, we have something a little bit more normal, if you will. For China to have initiated the call would have been extraordinary. No Chinese leaders actually initiated a call to an American leader since 1991. So it didn't happen this time. Anyway, that's roughly what I think about Japan's current posture. We can obviously say a lot more that goes to the fact that the United States still has over 55,000 troops on Japan. They occupy Japan under extraterritorial provisions, and they largely hold Japan to America's mercy. End of story.
Spot on. I do, however, want to mention one thing about the economic pressure that now China has over Japan. Einar, what do you think of how far will China go regarding the economic pressure that is now putting on Japan? When we think about rare earth elements, when we think about travel, when we think about the import of fish that China canceled, this kind of, how far will China go?
Well, China is showing. I mean, until she retracts those statements, you can expect the pressure to be intense.
Yeah.
To put it in perspective, Japan is dependent on trade with China to 20% of its GDP. For China, it's 5%. But you start looking into the numbers. For instance, tourism. People would surprised to know that is the second largest export economy for Japan. It is 2 to 3% of the GDP, depending on which year you look at. It's been increasing. China represents roughly a little over a third of that. If it was to go away, you could literally see Japan go into a recession. And that's before we start talking about seafood that is rotting on wharves because China won't let them in. The economic disruption will extend to Japanese companies here. They've canceled the flights directly between Japan and China. This means that they're all going to have to take an extra hop, skip, and a jump in order to get to their factories that are here. There's a tremendous amount of dependency. Remember, Japan has offshored much of its production. A lot of that production is in China. And then you have the issue that Japan imports a tremendous amount of things. They're actually, in hock to China every year in terms of a trade deficit. And so you have this emerging situation where she's going to have to try to back down, but she has this kind of nonsensical belief that she's an iron lady, a la Margaret Thatcher. So it's going to be very hard for her to figure out how to climb down from what she said I'm doing. She's tried already, said, well, I'll just be more careful in the future. That is not going to satisfy Beijing. This was an open violation of the 4 commitments that have treaties that have been signed between Japan and China, starting in 1972, then 78, then 98, then 2008. The first ones made it very clear that there's only one China, all right? And Taiwan is part of one China. The second 2 said that any kind of disputes would be settled through negotiations. And this is the second part of what she's violated, these kind of unilateral statements aimed at creating political popularity for herself, in the end is going to kill her off. The economic consequences will not be looked on gladly by a Japanese public that is already very concerned about a number of demographic shifts in terms of more elderly people, stagnant wages, an economy which has not gone forward since 1985 when the U.S. In essence forced it to sign the Plaza Accords. And I underline this by saying that the Japanese economy is worth less in real GDP terms today than it was in 1985 when it was at the heights. And it gives you an idea of just how damaging it was to the Japanese economy to have the U.S. force them into these Plaza Accords, and this is going to continue. So the economic realities will cut short her prime ministership, but the damage is going to continue for quite some time.
Very interesting. Warwick, I can't help it but to think in terms of what's going on in Asia with this kind of issues. You have Japan, you have South Korea, you have the Philippines, and so forth. And I can't help it but think to myself, is the U.S., and I'm going to ask you here, Warwick, is the U.S. aiming at reviving the idea of this mini-NATO in Asia against China?
Well, it's been doing this China containment thing since 1949. And its broad ambition, strategically speaking, hasn't fundamentally changed. The fact that it, from time to time, has to modify its tactical approaches in terms of who carries the responsibility, who bears the brunt, what the coordination mechanisms are, really reflects the extent to which the United States economy and industrial systems can actually carry the load, or it seeks to push the responsibilities for costs and the risks for deaths onto others. We've seen that it has fine-tuned its approach to cultivating proxy wars in other parts of the world, and it is now bringing those lessons to bear in the Asia Pacific. Unsurprisingly, the countries that you mentioned have a very particular relationship to the United States that leaves them vulnerable to precisely this kind of arrangement. Japan is a post-war client state. It is militarily occupied, as I mentioned. Philippines is a former colony, and in large part continues to depend on the United States for many aspects of its social and economic institutions. Not to mention the fact that political leaders often have strong ties to the United States in material terms. And of course, Australia has been part and parcel of the greater transatlantic white colonial settlement in this part of the world, and in some respects could be described as, at best, a sub-imperial power, transitioning from a relationship that saw the UK as the fulcrum leading up to the fall of Singapore, to one which now sees the United States as the focal point for Australia's sense of security within Asia. So all of these countries that you mentioned have particular vulnerabilities insofar as the United States is concerned. Unsurprisingly, the United States, given its economic constraints, given the problems that it actually has in its industrial complex, is seeking to mobilize others to carry on greater responsibilities. One thing I think you can be pretty sure of, and that is that there won't be an American at the front line in any conflict zone when the first shots are fired, but there will be plenty of Americans leading from well behind. And this is exactly where Asia is going at the moment. People across Asia, I think, are increasingly mindful of that and are wary of that. They know what the game is, and the sooner they can extricate themselves from this imbroglio, the better.
Interesting. The last thing I want to address with you, gentlemen, has to do with the Trump 28-point peace plan regarding Ukraine. What do you think, Einar? Will it succeed, first of all? And second, can the Russians trust Donald Trump?
Trust 42 convictions, 6 bankruptcies, I don't know, dozens of fraud. He's been accused of sexual harassment, rape. I don't know where trust really enters into it. This is a person who's perfected the art of not telling one lie in a day. You tell so many that they can't keep track of which ones you're doing. His way of doing it, he's in a populist politician, completely interested in themselves until the crypto took a bash the other day. He had almost tripled his net worth just in the first less than a year of being in the presidency. In terms of Ukraine, I don't even think he really cares. He has no empathy. You can see him. Whenever something bad happens, he just stands there and looks at them as if they're, somebody's scraping gum off the sidewalk. He never even pretends to try to help. He distances himself. He has no physical empathy whatsoever. And this has been brought up many, many times. And that goes on to the international stage. He doesn't seem to give a damn about all the children dying in Gaza. He does care about optics. In terms of how that would affect his getting a Nobel Prize, something he's fixated on. Mm-hmm. I think everything that's happening in Ukraine is just him throwing things against the wall and seeing what sticks. I remember just 5-6 weeks ago, he was saying that to Russia, he was saying, "Oh, I'm going to give the Ukrainians long-range missiles. They're going to defeat you. All right, you're done. I'm going to put pressure on everybody, and no one's going to buy your oil. 50% tariffs on India, supposedly an ally, a stop against China by the U.S." He doesn't care. So trust doesn't enter into it. He basically got a set of a wish list from Putin, put it on paper, sent it to Ukraine, and said, "You have till Thursday to accept." In his mind, whoa, this would be great if he accepts. All right, it's done. I get a Nobel Peace Prize. If he doesn't accept, I have a reason to cut off all aid, which I was intending to do anyways. But I need to manufacture something in order to say, oh well, I tried and he didn't go along with it. This is just the revolving door of trying to cajole Putin or slap Zelensky around. I mean, it's all the same thing. It's not serious diplomacy. It doesn't involve the other parties that need to be involved. There's no guarantors. I don't even know how you would begin to do this. There are no details. And this is emblematic of Donald Trump. I would challenge your readers to go back and look at any major thing that he has promised to do that he's actually done. And I mean in terms of a positive factor. Has he created a healthcare scheme? Has he brought prosperity to America? Yeah, he can do negative things. He can, hate immigrants and, on border protection and billions of dollars getting thugs to run around the country and seize people off the street. But that's executive action where it's all negative activity. I dare anybody to point out anything that he has done that has had a positive light, something that has improved the lives of Americans, has increased American standing abroad, or has given America a future.
Warwick, what do you think of this peace plan by which the Americans sidelined the Europeans? In other words, Europeans weren't even part of any of these conversations. What message is that sending?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is understand that this so-called plan is designed with one thing in mind only, and that is to spare the sitting president's blushes. No sitting US president wants to be responsible for a catastrophic military failure. And the last thing the sitting president wants is to be responsible for the downfall of Kiev. He spends a good amount of his time lambasting his predecessor about the debacle in Kabul. And what he does not want to have is to be seen historically as the bookend, the Kabul to Kiev bookend. So that's the first thing. We know that this has been the case of American military adventures ever since Vietnam, when the Pentagon Papers showed that American political leaders knew 7 years before the US actually pulled out of Vietnam that the game was up, that the war in Vietnam was already going to be lost. And yet, tens of thousands of American lives, together with millions of Vietnamese lives, were discarded because the American political leadership was looking for a way in which a decent interval could be fashioned to enable America to lose without disgrace. And I think that that's the first thing we need to understand about this particular 28-point plan. The second thing we need to understand about it is that it is in effect dead on arrival. It has already gone from 28 points to 19 points post discussions with the Europeans and the Ukrainians. The fact that the United States has to negotiate with Ukraine and the EU to get to the negotiating table with the Russians speaks volumes about the capacity of the US to actually sustain agreements that it reaches and be capable of ensuring that those agreements that it negotiates in bipartisan ways or in bilateral terms can actually stick. Clearly, it has a limit to the extent to which it can hold the line when its allies and its subordinates via NATO and its proxy in the form of Ukraine refuse to play along. So that's the second thing to note. And the last thing to note is that many of the criticisms of the current plan, whether it's the 28-point or the 19-point or the 30-point or whichever particular version we're talking about, is that it's too pro-Russian. Well, there's a reason for that. Russia's winning. And the maths is actually unassailable. The tipping point in terms of the effects of attritional warfare is now upon us, and sometime over the next 6 to 9 months, the effects on the ground will become horrifically evident. The nature of attritional war is that at a superficial level, the balance of forces appears to be quite stable. So we've had 18 months or so of talk of a stalemate. But in reality, what's happening is that the bleeding out of one side is at a rate far greater than it can replenish itself. And as time goes by, what begins as a trickle ultimately leads into a gush. And the situation has more or less reached that point. So Russia's in a position where it has no reason to entertain any concessions of substance when its war aims articulated in 2022 have not yet been achieved, but ones in which the President Putin, insists are the war aims and they will be achieved. Now, the last thing, I guess, to wrap all of this little discussion up is to remember that not only does Russia talk about root causes and insists that they be addressed, they actually laid out in December 2021 two documents which in effect explains to the world where Russia's coming from. One document was an agreement draft between Russia and NATO, and the second was a treaty draft between the United States and Russia. And both of these documents actually go to the heart of what Russia articulates are its principal concerns that led to the war in Ukraine. Now, unless people pay serious attention to what's in these documents and subsequent commentary and remarks that have only reinforced these objectives, then the West is not serious about resolving the issues in that part of the world. So it's a whole bunch of theatre designed to spare the president's blushes. It's dead on arrival, and Russia is going to achieve its objectives one way or the other.
Very interesting. Just for the community, speaking of what Einar and Warwick were talking about here, remember to join me tomorrow. I will be talking to Larry Johnson about this particular issue. He just got back from Moscow. I was in talks with him. So remember to join me tomorrow. We will be talking about extending this topic here. So I want to give you a last word, gentlemen, before I let you go. But I wanted to, if it will be okay, for you to just give us an idea of what can the world anticipate from the meeting of the two global superpowers in April 2026. I like to get ahead of things just to be aware of what might the world anticipate? I'll start with you, Einar.
Well, I don't think there's much to anticipate. China will continue to engage, try to be the adult in the room. Donald will be looking for leverage. Prior to that meeting, expect Donald Trump to do his usual, madman politics. You'll see an upswing through proxies, attacking China, maybe some new tariffs or something like that. He likes to, before he comes in, he likes to create a little commotion, but not too much commotion. He really loves to be feted at these types of events. He likes to see a real marching parade. It was an embarrassment to him on his birthday when all they could do was saunter around like they were going off to the Saturday night party. Don't expect any major breakthroughs. This is just part of China trying to get through the next 3 years that they have with China, with Donald Trump. After that, you don't know. But it's going to be a very difficult time. Remember, against this backdrop, the United States is still committed to containing China. The results of that commitment has been to create global economic downturn. And that has social political consequences in terms of people are dying. In addition to that, governments are falling, not through necessarily a fault of their own, but simply because they're not able to address the complex issues created by the U.S. Within their own countries themselves. The world is globally connected, and Donald Trump is trying to reverse that. So expect for the next 3 years very difficult times. Donald Trump will not change his pattern of behavior, and China is just trying to survive and hopefully make the rest of the world understand that they either hang together or they're going to hang separately. Things like BRICS, SCO, ASEAN +1, all of these things are necessary in order to create an alternative world order where it is not completely dependent on these rapacious colonial powers.
Very insightful. Warwick, what do you think?
Well, that's a bit of a hard act to follow.
You can do it.
You can do it.
Well, I'll lead us down the slippery path towards the end of today's show. Look, I think the question come April next year is going to be what the state of the United States economy will be in the lead up to the midterm elections. So the midterm election and the campaign will be well and truly underway. And many of those domestic considerations, I think, will impinge upon the way in which President Trump will frame his priorities and how he tries to sell the message of this global summit. Remember, not so long ago, President Trump talked about the meeting in Busan as a G2. Now, of course, this is an Obama title, which surprisingly President Trump re-articulated. But needless to say, China didn't buy into that particular narrative framing. But that said, President Trump, of course, sees these sorts of summits as important to the way in which he presents himself as a global statesman and as a way of framing the domestic narrative around the successes of the administration, mainly through tough guy diplomacy. America is now respected again, etc., etc. But the critical issue is going to be where the United States economy is going to be come April. Will inflation, as a result of tariffs, continue to bubble away and lead to a weakening of consumer sentiment, for example, and a decline in people's living standards? Will unemployment continue to trickle upwards as it's starting to do now? Will the costs of industry begin to be felt as investment declines and investment confidence in the short-term profitability of additional capital infrastructure diminish? Can the bubble that's currently propping up American GDP in the artificial intelligence sector be sustained until the midterm elections? So there's a lot of questions, I think, that will impinge upon the way that President Trump will approach the meeting in April. Of course, as Einar indicated, on the other side of the table will be the Chinese, and the Chinese are, unsurprisingly, incredibly predictable in the way that they position themselves, because they have taken a very long-term view as to how they think the world can be, how they think the world ought to be, how they think the world is, and as a consequence of that, how they believe China needs to conduct itself and interact with other nations. And I would expect that the way that China has done that for many years will define the way that it does that going forward. So that's what I think it's going to be. In other words, I don't have a clue what's going to happen and what to expect next year. But I think these are some of the issues that will exercise the minds of those who will be involved in putting the itinerary and program together, and in President Trump's attempts to shape the atmosphere in the lead up to the summit.
Well, both of you, your perspectives are so insightful. I mean, as a matter of fact, we don't know. A lot can happen between now and then, but nonetheless, still hearing your insights regarding this, what lies ahead, some sort of gives, at least for me personally, an idea of at least what to be looking for. So I can't thank you enough, Einar, Warwick, really, for carving out time for my community here, because they always are excited to listen to you, to hear from you, to learn from you. And it's always a great time and a great treat to have you here to share your perspective. On behalf of the entire community, I say thank you so much, and I look forward to having you again.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Warwick.
Thank you all.
Hi, guys. I hope you all enjoyed listening to Einar and Warwick. Very, very insightful perspectives, individuals who know what they're talking about. And I always look for that time of the month where we can meet and, of course, discuss. There's a host of issues with such depth, and we are so grateful to them. They are busy individuals, and yet they're really always excited to be here. So remember to join me tomorrow once again for my conversation with Larry Johnson at 12:15 Central Standard Time. And I take this opportunity quickly to say thank you to AFU. Thank you very much for your super sticker in support of the channel. I mean, you did it twice. I agree with the statements about Philippines. These lapdog politicians have no shame. Exactly. Einar and Warwick sort of situated to this, just in a different way, but you are absolutely correct. Kevin Baptist, thank you so much for your support for the channel, and look forward to seeing you again. To all of you, I say good night, and I hope you enjoyed listening to my guest. As always, remember, geopolitics impact your daily life in more ways than one. Till next time. Bye-bye.